Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren. I'm the chief economist at American Compass, and today we are joined by Geoffrey Cain, author of The Perfect Police State, author of Samsung Rising, and one of the leading experts on and observers of the behavior of American companies in China. That, of course, is a subject we are very interested in here at American Compass, and it is especially relevant at the moment as debates heat up over chips and AI chip sales to China. We have a few firms, Nvidia in particular, the leading AI chip maker, lobbying very aggressively to be able to sell chips in China for reasons that appear entirely at odds with the American national interest, but perhaps aligned with the interest of Nvidia shareholders. And that is creating a lot of conflicts. But this is something we've, of course, seen many times with all sorts of U.S. companies, obviously a lot of manufacturers, but also a lot of tech companies, some of whom who have learned their lessons and left, some of whom who are still there and still conducting themselves in quite questionable ways. And Jeff, I think, does a great job explaining both what is going on in a lot of these cases, but also why it's going on and what it might take if the U.S. wanted to curtail that kind of behavior. So really enjoyed that conversation. I think this is something over the next couple months that's going to be an especially important issue as we try to figure out what to do on the AI front. So stick around for that. But of course, also have to tell you a little bit about what's happening at Commonplace this week. In particular, had a really great essay from Julius Krein. Julius is, of course, longtime friend of American Compass. In fact, a member of our board, also the editor of American Affairs, also the chairman at the New American Industrial Alliance, or NIA, which is really leading a lot of the efforts on the private sector side on reindustrialization, especially in defense tech. And he wrote about the concept of a sovereign wealth fund, which the Trump administration has certainly shown a lot of interest in. I think there are some quite nonsensical ways to do such a fund, but also some really valuable ones. And Julius really differentiates between the two and describes exactly what it would look like to use that sort of instrument to really push reindustrialization, reshoring of manufacturing. So be sure to check that out. Of course, go subscribe at commonplace.org, where you'll get regular articles, Understanding America every week with the latest from around the web and my own thoughts on what's going on, and the weekly podcast. And this week we proceed with Geoff Cain. Enjoy. And we are joined now by Geoff Cain. Jeff, thank you for making the time to talk.
Good to be here, Oren.
We were talking a little about some of what was going on with Nvidia, with some of the AI chips heading to China, the general posture they have toward investing in China. And they are maybe the most prominent example at the moment, but in a long and unproud line or tradition, perhaps. And so, you've covered this for a long time, looked at sort of use of technology in the Chinese police state, more broadly, kind of what motivates a lot of these actors. And so, wanted to have you on to talk a little bit about just what's really going on, what is the level of interaction, involvement, and also kind of the why, like why does this happen, and what, if anything, we do about it. So really interested to get your thoughts on it, and maybe that's the place to start, just with the broad question: how, in some senses we've been decoupling from China for a while now. How would you characterize the engagement of the U.S. tech industry, investment industry, with China, the Chinese government, the Chinese market at this point?
So it's a troubling situation. Yes, you are right. There have been sanctions. There has been the decoupling, the tariffs that have just gone into effect. But the fact of the matter is that U.S. big tech firms, not all of them, but the bad actors, the ones who are chasing profit above all, have tethered themselves so closely to the Chinese state, the Chinese government, that there's just no backing out anymore. It's a situation where major companies such as Microsoft here in the U.S., their China operations have effectively, in practice, been captured, although they will deny that, if you're going to ask them directly. I mean, other companies too. Apple, the excellent book by Patrick McGee recently detailed the story of Apple in China and how China effectively now controls those supply chains. Apple has lost control of them, and now we're in this really dangerous situation in which we are dependent on the world's largest police state for a vast majority of our technology here in the U.S. So to back up a little, it's an alarming history because really when this started happening, it was the high age of globalization. So we're talking about the 1990s, the 2000s. There was a free trade agreement being signed seemingly every week. It was the age of the opening market, the promise that globalization will lift people out of poverty everywhere, that there will be this natural transgression to liberal democracy, that the end of history is the idea that liberal Democrats will end up seizing power, that the middle class would rise. The middle class would be the affluent class that declares the need for democracy and rebels against totalitarian states. So there were people, even speeches by Bill Clinton at the time, talking about how democracy might come to China one day if we embark on this goal of the dream of globalization. Lots of this during the time period, and this is when companies, I'll mention. I think Microsoft is a great example. Microsoft with Bill Gates at the helm wanted access to the Chinese market back then because that's more than a billion customers potentially. I mean, if everybody in China one day, and remember, we're talking 1990s, this is when the internet hadn't spread so far yet. But one day, in the long run, there was the potential for everybody in China, every company in China would have computers, they would be loaded with Windows. And so it was just a massive, massive market potential for Microsoft. Bill Gates opened a lab there called Microsoft Research Asia. That was a kind of public relations gesture. What was happening at the time was that Microsoft was getting destroyed in China because of these pirated CDs, pirated Windows software that people were loading on their computers. And the Chinese government was refusing to cooperate with them, refusing to help them solve this problem because they weren't really playing the game in China. This is how it works in China. You go there, you play the game with the Communist Party, you embrace the market there, embrace the authoritarian rules, and then the Communist Party will show up with the red carpet and they'll help you get out of this situation. So there was a decision back then to go massively into the Chinese market because one, that was the future, and then two, Microsoft's leaders realized that the only way they could stop this piracy problem and get access to these 1 billion potential customers was to play ball with the Chinese Communist Party. Microsoft Research Asia. So I used to live in China for many years. I was a reporter in East Asia doing investigative journalism, and one of my specialties was digging into the China-based operations of many of these companies. Microsoft was originally the one that caught my eye when I was in China because the institute that they founded there, Microsoft Research Asia, I was documenting and following many of the executives and many of the developers who had gone through this laboratory. It now does AI, it's done all kinds of technologies, but it's there to do cutting edge advanced technology. And one of the things I noticed, so I was in Western China in a region called Xinjiang, where the Uyghurs have been facing genocide, put in concentration camps. It's a massive surveillance dragnet. Literally, they called it Skynet. That was the Chinese government's name for the surveillance system. And as I was doing my research, I kept noticing that certain star figures would resign from Microsoft Research Asia. They would move on, found their own billion-dollar unicorn company, either in Hong Kong, mainland China. And these companies were, they were trained by Microsoft. These people were trained by Microsoft, and then they would go develop facial recognition, voice recognition, various AI-based technologies that the Chinese government would then roll out in this region of China, Xinjiang, where the Uyghur genocide was happening. I noticed this pattern, and whenever I would look at them, I would, it came to a point where I could guess, like, hey, I'll bet this guy went through Microsoft at some point. And lo and behold, I would do some, background research on them, look at their CV, and there's the Microsoft Research Asia, point in there at some point.
And to be clear, from a timeline perspective, so we're not talking about the 1990s so much. This is the 2010s. This is long after the kind of theoretical period of if only we embrace and work with China, they will become a liberal democracy. I'm curious, I mean, it's also to some extent long beyond the time when Microsoft is like making its money selling Windows. So it seems to me there's a real distinction between companies that are reliant on China for supply chains, which is certainly, Apple, and we had Patrick on the show. He did a great job explaining what's going on with Apple. In some senses, you see this with Tesla now, where we could talk about what choices Elon Musk made and why, but sort of ended up very dependent on the Chinese production system. That seems less the case, though, for something like a Microsoft, right? Like, why? I mean, you could just say, well, because there are a lot of customers there, but what is the calculus for a Microsoft to still be running Research Asia in the 2010s in that way?
Well, there's a lot of money in it. There's a lot of advanced money making technology that can come out of these Chinese offices that they have. But then just the mere fact of the matter, this is the reality now. If Microsoft were to stand up and say no to the Chinese Communist Party, or if they were to say we're exiting, um, the fact of the matter is that the Chinese Communist Party has such a vast dragnet of surveillance in the country, such powerful laws that they could use against Microsoft, that a lot of that tech would simply be looted. Microsoft, you know, and this has happened to other companies, Chinese companies in China, also U.S. companies over there. If Microsoft were to suddenly exit or say we're closing this, we're closing that, the government would seize technologies. They would force employees and executives to hand over these sensitive technologies. They would be using it for military purposes. And even I would venture to say that some Microsoft executives would be put in prison if that were to
Hmm.
happen. And this is literally something that's happened. The Chinese government does make a practice of either the Chinese government does make it a practice of either refusing departure for people who want to leave the country, or downright arresting or harassing executives there. And a lot of it doesn't even get into the news. In my line of work, I've heard all kinds of stories that have been off the record or on background where it's like there's an executive being harassed or is under arrest right now, but the company doesn't want it getting out. It's going to look really bad. So Microsoft has its hands tied. They're in a double bind. The way that the global order is now set up is that you can choose one or the other. If you're a big tech company, you can play by the rules of the Chinese Communist Party, or you can play by the rules of the U.S. government. You can't do both. You can't have two flags anymore. And that's simply because the laws of both countries make it so hard to please the other. So, just to give one example, in China, it is a regulatory offense. It's breaking the law to cooperate with U.S. sanctions a lot of the time. So, you know, the U.S. puts a sanction on some technology. You refuse to work with the Chinese government. Well, I guess you're in trouble now because you can't follow what the U.S. says. You have to work with China.
And it seems like there are a few different approaches. Your point, you're kind of in a point where you have to choose one or the other. Describe some of the approaches different firms have taken, because looking at what Google has ended up doing, what Facebook has ended up doing, people have gone different ways on it. What are some of the best illustrations of the different kinds of choices companies have made?
Right. Well, Facebook is a great example because they used to be courting China. Mark Zuckerberg very famously visited China about 10 years ago. He spoke Chinese. He was studying Chinese. Um, you know, he was photographed jogging in Tiananmen Square. I mean, it was truly a public relations campaign to show that Facebook would be a friend of China. But looking at the market, looking at the censorship that was going on, looking at the way that Chinese companies were being protected by their own government, the Facebook executives ultimately decided that there was going to be no future in China, that the juice is not worth the squeeze, and it was just going to be trouble. Um, Google, another great example. Google does not, Google is blocked in China. You have to use a VPN to access it. And Google originally was operating in China, but they pulled out because the censorship was just getting too bad. It's just too much of a compromise of your fundamental business model to allow your search engine to be that heavily censored. So, there's often an argument made, Apple will say this, Tim Cook has said this, Microsoft will say things like this, that look, it's a globalized world and we have to operate in different markets to survive. If we don't expand into other markets, if we don't play by their rules, then we're losing out to our competition. So we have to do it. But That's a completely false dichotomy. It's a logical error because you can go to all sorts of companies in the US and not just big tech, but biotech, healthcare type companies. I mean, there are lots of firms out there that have consciously made the decision not to do business in China because they've seen what happens when they, outsource manufacturing too heavily, when they start to rely on the Chinese state for their future. They've seen where that heads, and it's a very dark road, and they've decided not to go with it.
And that's something that I guess strikes me is I have some sympathy for companies that in the 90s or the early 2000s said, here we go, right? Like there was certainly a case to be made. It was going to pay off. There was an expectation about the trajectory that it was on. And if you did that back then and then you got stuck, well, that's really unfortunate. It's very different, it seems to, in the 2010s, you decide, and this is where I think the Elon Musk situation, where like, did he think he was going to outsmart the CCP in 2017? I mean, hey, look, he made it, he made his money. Did it now matter what the long-term end game was going to be? But then the other thing that we see now, and chips is probably the best example of this, and I want to talk about kind of now the AI chips, but first there was this fascinating situation back when the CHIPS Act was being discussed in 2022, effort by the US to really subsidize chip making. And there was this question, okay, what kind of guardrails should be on the funding that might constrain the business these companies are doing in China? And the argument that some of the chip companies made, and Intel in particular was very aggressive in making this argument, I think, was no, you don't want to push us out of China. That's what China wants. So you should want us to stay in China. And I remember hearing that thinking like, if you know that China's plan is to squeeze you for everything you're worth and then push you out, like, then what are you still doing there? There seem to be a lot of companies that maybe it's just kind of, well, how much more cash can we generate before the music stops? Or some that are in denial. I'm kind of curious from the like investigative reporter perspective, how you understood the decisions folks were making, which ones were rational and which ones were just didn't even make sense on their own terms at times.
Well, here's the problem. If you're in the chip industry, any chip, the fab plants, the manufacturing lines, the processes, the hiring of talent, this is very niche talent. All of that takes years and years and years of investment of building with no guarantee of success. The chip industry is one of the riskiest industries in the world. I mean, chips are the most complicated things ever made by humankind. They are a vastly complicated technology, and these companies, places like Intel, Nvidia has been moving more into China recently with Jensen Huang visiting. It took them decades of work, not only to get the regulatory approvals in China, but to actually build those fab plants and to get things going. And once they exit, if the US government, say in the CHIPS Act, were to say, okay, in exchange for this CHIPS money, you have to reduce your exposure to China by X%. The moment that they leave, they've lost so much leverage in that market. And what they're betting is, okay, so maybe this is a moment that's going to pass. What if we hold out, do everything we can do to stay in China, and then we're still there, but we're much more advanced 10 years down the road. We're going to control massive supply chains in China. It's an extremely lucrative and profitable situation to be in. But then the alternative is, okay, so you pull out. If you want to enter back in the future, let's say the market loosens again, it's going to take you, 10 years, possibly even 15 years to go back and to build those same capabilities in China. So, they're playing, it's a gamble. They're thinking long-term when they're thinking, just hold out for this moment, go lobby in DC, go, represent our interests. And if we can just hold out, then we'll be fine. But the moment that we have to exit, we've invested so much money. It's a sunk cost fallacy, essentially. Invested so much that we are we are gonna lose from this deal. It's better to hold out and to stay as long as possible.
And how does that intersect with whether you want to call it kind of moral or political judgment of the people involved in? I mean, you've documented especially the way a lot of this technology is now used sort of outright in surveillance, certainly under the military civil fusion doctrine. A lot of what you're doing, even if it's commercial on its face, potentially has military applications as well. You're also, as you described, regardless of what you yourself are making, are training and developing talent that is going to go on to do those things. Um, and quite oddly, or maybe not oddly at all, this was all coming to a head at the exact same time in the US, the corporate social responsibility and ESG and kind of what we were told was this just undeniable push by the next generation to assert a more, moral and socially aware approach to business was taking hold. Is there just sort of a line somewhere in the middle of the Pacific, and when you're on the other side of the line, those things don't count anymore?
Well, I think you just summed up the exact problem. That is the contradiction. And, a lot of the culture wars that we've seen in the US, these ESG movements and stakeholder rights movements that companies have to be something other than a profit-making enterprise. That's a smokescreen for what's actually happening around the world. If you're in the US and, you're watching, these companies talk about their great values, how they're saving the environment and fighting racial injustice and so forth. None of that applies in China. They don't care about that in China or Hong Kong. You'll see. So, I mean, just to give one example from a few years back, the NBA had a scandal. They were encouraging, young people to go protest against the police in the U.S. This was at the height of the George Floyd protests. They were playing that culture war angle really hard because that was their audience in the U.S. But then at the same time, there were massive protests, pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong. The Hong Kong police are, beating up protesters, taking them away to jail because they held up a sign. And Nike and the NBA, silence. It's complete silence because that's such a big market for them.
Right.
China, they've been really trying to get basketball going in China. They've been building a massive presence, and the NBA is only one example of that. I mean, Disney filmed Mulan. Part of Mulan was filmed in Xinjiang just as the concentration camps were being built there. And not only that, but they filmed it not far from a concentration camp, probably fully knowing what was going on. I mean, the hypocrisy of these companies is truly astounding. And, let me put it this way. If we could use 10% of the energy currently going into American culture wars, if 10% of that energy were applied to authoritarian regimes, to promoting democracy around the world, the outcomes would be so much better. I mean, it's just a slice of that energy would actually do things that really matter around the world.
Yeah, I want to run an idea by you that's sort of on that front, and it connects back to your point about you can really only operate in one world or the other at this point. On the tech side, we've just been talking about how on the sort of social or political side, you're very much welcome to operate in both at once. It seems to me, and a few folks have been kicking around this idea that we actually have a way to create a comparable, you can only operate in one world function there, to be blunt about it, by holding hearings. Like if the US actually has the capacity to force business leaders to say what they really think and their actual experience with their business operations and with the CCP under oath in public. And that's only a problem for them if they're trying to lie. Like it would not in theory be a problem for them to say like, yeah, China's doing a lot of terrible things. We think it's really bad. Presumably at the same time, that would make them persona non grata in China, right? So maybe that's not like the right mechanism, but does something along those lines potentially help to kind of force a choice on some of this stuff?
Well, I actually testified a couple of years ago before the Homeland Security Committee, HISGAC, and that's one of the cases I was trying to make. I told them, hey, you have subpoena power, subpoena some CEOs. Let's see the TikTok CEOs come out here. Let's see Microsoft come out here. Let's see all these companies CEOs come out here and lay out what they're actually doing in China. But sadly, that's never happened. I mean, just a year ago, Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, testified before Congress, and he made an astounding claim. They asked him if he has to follow the law in China, and he said that Microsoft essentially does not have to follow laws in China. And the panel was astounded. There was a Democratic, member of Congress who questioned him on that one. But it's like, okay, so how can you go in front of Congress and outright say that you have a massive presence in this police state around the world, and you actually don't have to follow their laws? What those laws say is that anybody who's requested to hand over data or information or intelligence, anybody in China who gets that request from the government has to follow it, and it has to hand over that data, or else they could face prison time. So this is a very harsh law, and it's one of many examples. There was just one incident just very recently. So just to give you an example of this, Microsoft runs a program called MAP. And what this is, so this is a program where they will discover vulnerabilities in the software, in the code, and then what they'll do ahead of time, this is a common practice in cybersecurity, they'll share it with partners, with vendors. They'll share the vulnerability before it goes public, because that gives these partners a chance to sew up the vulnerability. The reasoning being that if they were simply to release the vulnerability in public and patch it right away, their vendors and their partners actually wouldn't have enough time to solve that problem, and so they'd be open to cyber attack. But here's the problem with this program now. They've been giving these vulnerabilities, they've been showing them to companies in China that are aligned and connected to the Chinese Communist Party. And so just recently there was a hack of many government agencies, including the U.S. Nuclear Safety Body. I mean, a very devastating hack that came out of all this. So Microsoft is now investigating whether code that they had given to a Chinese partner was then used by the Chinese government to launch a massive cyber attack on the U.S. So they're starting to admit it, which is good. But it's deeply worrisome. I mean, it's troubling because people have been pointing out these problems for years. I mean, this goes back so far, and companies are now only waking up to it because they're under political pressure in Washington.
Right. The logic of it seems to me, is something that almost has to be inevitable, in that, we work obviously a lot on trade issues and make the case that at the end of the day, you're going to have to decouple in these areas where Chinese behavior just makes kind of a free market impossible. There's the same issue on kind of the investment side, where the idea that you want to, have U.S. investors. I want to come back to investment also, that, U.S. investors, their profits are subject to the whims of the CCP, or conversely, you have the CCP controlling large assets in the United States, seems absurd. We're starting to see these conflicts on what I would call the institutional side, where, university, research partnerships and so forth can't really function. But then the entire tech ecosystem seems like it's the same thing ultimately, that, especially as we get into more potentially differentiated models of AI built into a lot of these ecosystems, the idea that you're going to be able to have interoperable, integrated Chinese and broader Chinese sphere and US and American sphere systems, it just seems like it can't work. Like that the only question is how long and how long is it going to take, and how much pain are we going to go through before we realize we can't do it? Do you think that's right? And are we at all down the road of figuring it out, if it is?
Yeah, it's a tough question, because I think that it can go many different ways now. I think that we are at the turning point, and I think that, Nvidia, so the CEO Jensen Huang, now visiting China, wanting to sell this new H2O chip to China, which was a great letter, by the way, wonderful letter, and it's for him to be doing that after all these sanctions, after talk of tariffs, it's blowing against the wind. But it also shows that there is not you could say there's not an elite consensus in America. It used to be that the consensus was forming that China is a major threat, that we do have to treat China as a military threat and rival. It's not a trading partner alone. And we have to enact all these sanctions. That was happening 8-9 years ago. It was really picking up. But for Jensen Huang to suddenly pick up and do this trip right after he met with the president, President Trump in America, it shows there's some kind of calculated gamble going on here. And if he can start selling these chips, it's going to be the floodgates opening because, every other company that wants to be operating in China now, this lucrative market, they're going to be knocking on that door too, and they're going to say, look at what Nvidia is doing. I think it's a terrible idea. I mean, it is just to sell that particular chip being used for advanced AI applications to China when China has publicly stated that it wants to use AI to build national military power and overtake its neighbors. That's just it's handing them the keys. It's this Trojan horse that is a major threat on many different fronts. And it's not just a military threat, but it's a threat to our supply chains, to our trade. It's a threat to the regional security of China's neighbors around it. It's a threat to Taiwan, which makes many of the world's chips. I mean, this is the kind of decision that years down the road can ricochet into all these different areas because chips are so foundational and fundamental to the global economy.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me in a lot of ways of Tesla moving to Shanghai in 2017 and what that means a decade later for the EV industry, the battery industry, and so forth. I guess it's interesting in defense of, but also making even worse the Nvidia situation, because they're a fabless company, it's not like they're building the chip fabs in China. They just want to sell the end chips. And so in some respects, you could say like, well, look, there's a question then of what they do with them, but you're not exactly handing over the keys to the kingdom. It's very hard to reverse engineer a chip from the chip. On the other hand, all the points you made about kind of sunk costs and needing to, build up the infrastructure and so forth don't even apply. Like they're really just it kind of just seems like a cash grab. And let me ask you, make the best possible argument that this is a good idea, right? Like if you listen to what was supposed to be the administration, the Trump administration, others have said the claim is somehow that this is going to help kind of entrench US tech in the Chinese ecosystem. Can you give that is that at all plausible? Is there some way in which there is some benefit to the US in allowing it?
So I think that, if we wanted to do a steel man and give the very best possible argument in favor, it's that, look, at least China is pouring billions, trillions of dollars even into catching up with the US and developing these chips. They're going to control that technology. They're going to keep it secret and confidential. At least if we allow Nvidia and Intel to have some command of the Chinese market, we can at least control that tech in some way. That technology is responsive to US law. And so, we have that relationship with Nvidia and Jensen Huang. And so by keeping them on a leash in China, this won't go off the rails. So you could argue it does give the US leverage. It also gives a diplomatic leverage point in the future for trade negotiations because these chips are going to be valuable. And, if the CCP wants to push on something or wants to, get aggressive, well, say goodbye to those chips. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be a deterrent for them. But here's the thing. So, yes, you are right. It is very hard to reverse engineer, but we should not underestimate the sheer power and intrusiveness of the Chinese Communist Party, its surveillance state, and how deep it goes, how deep it's infiltrated into all aspects of Chinese society. Literally, 1984, any of these dystopian science fiction novels, you could argue that they were written about the Chinese Communist Party in the 2020s because it's become so sophisticated over there. And, would you hand them an F-35 jet and expect them not to look for every single flaw or hole that they can find? Even if it is very difficult to reverse engineer a chip, they have some of the best scientists in the world. They have resources. They have intrusion into companies. I mean, every company there has to have a Chinese Communist Party committee that enforces political ideology that reports to the Chinese Communist Party. They're going to find a way to exploit every ounce of this chip that they can. Even if they can't reverse engineer it, they're going to learn so much about the architecture of our technology, how our AI works, our supply chains, where the things are coming from, and they're going to find ways to exploit those holes in ways that we can't see. So I think it's a bad idea regardless, and it really is like handing over a key in a way, even if it is hard to reverse engineer. They're still going to do what they can with it.
I don't know. I think maybe the idea of starting to sell them a lot of F-35s to create dependence on our F-35s could be the next big move. You may have just come up with a savvy new strategy.
The secrets, yeah, the Trojan horse strategy. There we go.
Perfect. The I guess if I talk about it, Nvidia, this is sort of these chips is one element of what has been a bigger picture. I believe they've said they're opening a research center in Shanghai. There's been this longer running issue of chip diversion in the face of export controls, where they've taken the seemingly ludicrous position that chip diversion simply is not happening. I think is the direct quote from Jensen Huang, even though the chips are there. Like, it's not actually a very disputable issue as far as I can tell. Um, how how do you assess that? If you were to sort of having seen so many companies do this over so much time, I don't want to just cynically say, well, this is just what you have to do to make as much money as you can in China. But is like Occam's razor? Is it sometimes that's kind of all there is to it? Or would you complexify the story at all?
So complexify it, you mean to that it's about more than profit, that there's something else going on here?
Yeah, in any way, or that, it kicks back to Nvidia's ability to be successful in the US, or that I don't know, it could always be more than merely, well, that's the best way to make as much money in China as possible.
Right. Well, one of the arguments that people often make is the argument of technology diffusion, that by going over there, by working with China, by selling chips in China, we can also learn from China about this technology. We can learn what they're doing and we can bring it back here. There's actually a term called pizza effect, which is sort of how things developed. And it's called the pizza effect because pizza was made in Italy and then it was transplanted to America and then went back to Italy and so forth. And you can see that in the world of technology too. And it is actually true. I mean, I don't want to be unfair to the argument that people are making because, like a lot of the facial recognition technology that was used on Skype for many years, a lot of these developments did happen in China. And, though they have very, horrible potential, they also have good potential when they're used in the right way. And, one of the reasons Skype was so successful for so long was because of some of this facial recognition used in, created in China, brought to the US. But, the flip side of that is, well, facial recognition is used in China to surveil everybody now. And even in the US, we're kind of living in this surveillance era where there are cameras on every street corner that can figure out who we are in seconds. So, you are right. It's always more complicated. There's always more to it. But the bottom line is, there are some issues that no matter how much you complexify it, there are still these bottom line problems that we have to grapple with that aren't actually that complex. And, one of them is China's massive human rights record. It's horrible human rights record. We can't have U.S. companies going to China and helping them develop technologies that are going to be used against their people. I mean, that's just simply wrong. And it doesn't matter what kind of legal or jurisdictional argument you make. It's just not the right thing to do. And I could go on with many examples of this. The national security threat. China has stated publicly, Xi Jinping has stated many times over and over for the last decade, technology is the sharp weapon of the state, to quote him directly. I like one of the things I've learned in all my years, in both, sorry, my cat is meowing in the background there, running around. So one of the things that I've learned in all my years, both in investigative journalism, also in Washington policy, I spent some time at the House Foreign Affairs Committee too. When somebody says they're going to do something, when a government says they're going to do something, take them at their word. If Putin says, I'm going to invade Ukraine, like people brush him off for years. They said, you're not going to invade Ukraine. And he did exactly that. When Xi Jinping says, I'm going to invade Taiwan, people are still brushing him off. They're saying, come on, that can't happen. That's so outlandish. Why would he do that? It's going to cause a, world war. He says he's going to do it, and he might do it. And that's one of the things that we always need to pay attention to.
Yeah. The point about the human rights I think is really helpful because at the end of the day, a lot of these do come down to just economic self-interest arguments and ways in which, look, companies pursuing their own profit just don't necessarily align with with the national interest on the American side. But there is this other dimension that it's like, well, even if the pizza theory is right as a matter of, or pizza effect is right as a matter of economics, like at some point, let's channel their genocidal authoritarianism into useful breakthroughs for us is just the not necessarily the model we want, I guess.
Yeah,
Um,
that's exactly true. And that's the worry here, I think.
yeah. So one more question for you, just on kind of the investment side of things, because there's a lot of interest in the outbound investment question. Um, I think in response, when people say that we shouldn't have venture capital investing over there, we shouldn't have, private equity investing over there, something people say is like, well, China doesn't have like a capital problem. I mean, China, if anything, is they're flooding capital into the US. If China just needs to invest more capital domestically, it will. Um, the counter argument to that is that it's not necessarily about the dollars. It's about the know-how and the expertise and everything else that a VC ecosystem or private equity managers bring with them, as well as then just their own dependence on being nice to the Chinese Communist Party. Um, how important do you think each of those arguments are? How much is the actual capital important? How much is it about the technical expertise and know-how and management? And how much is it about just the dangers of being tangled?
Well, it's all three. I think that you just named the three big problems, but the problem of capital flows, so U.S. investments going to China, and we're not just talking about venture capitalists writing a check, but major financial firms such as BlackRock have been expanding into China. Uh, American universities have major investments, so their endowments and also people's retirement accounts are in China. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that, if you have an IRA, if you have any kind of retirement account, there's a good chance that you're funding some kind of military or national security threat in China. Your retirement money is literally sitting in some of these companies. But the problem now is that since this has been such a long and complicated process of creating this expansion, the problem now is that it's hard to separate these portfolios. They're so intertwined in this complicated global supply chain that it's sometimes hard for a portfolio manager to go in and to say, okay, I found it. Here's the here's the unethical investment. Here's the one that we need to pull out, because it's often so opaque and so shadowed by all these other operations that you can't quite see it. So that's why I actually favor a blunter approach instead of trying to slowly decouple and look for different facets of the supply chain that can be separated, or investments that can be separated. I'm more in favor of a stronger and more forthright approach in which we simply don't work with certain industries in China, because the nature of many of these technologies is that they are what we would call dual use technologies. You're funding a chip, but that same chip can be put into a missile or a jet and then launched right back at you. And that's what the worry is right there. So yes, like what you said before, the complicated nature of all of this, it is important, but sometimes you just need strong action to ensure that there's nothing wrong going on here.
Yeah, that's certainly my perspective as well. We do at American Compass, we call it the hard break from China,
That's good.
as distinguished from the sort of decoupling, which, as you said, at one extreme could look like a hard break, but can also be code for like, let's very gently try to, with a scalpel, find very specific things, when at the end of the day, it is a much more kind of fundamentally corrupt and corrupting for us relationship. So,
It is a
um,
systemic problem. It's not a
yes.
scalpel. And one of the things I always learned in my days as a journalist is that China is extremely opaque. And if you try to take a scalpel and pick apart that relationship with the US, you're going to spend thousands of years. I mean, you're going to be a fossil by the time you've solved this problem. So we need that heartbreak, as you said.
Well, Jeff, thank you for all the work you're doing. I just sit here and talk about it. You've actually been on the ground reporting. Your books on this stuff are fantastic.
Thank you, Oren. Appreciate that.
And thank you so much for making the time to join us.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great to be here.
And we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass Podcast.